The formal welcome, will be given by the chair. My duty here is very short. Can I ask you to please turn off your phones? Put it on vibrate, please. Sometimes we don't remember. Silence or vibrate is perfect. And then to remind you that we are indeed streaming live. So, shall I say act accordingly? Yes. Welcome again. I am Sharon Bogues-Wolf from the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy. I'm going to introduce our chairperson, and then I'm going to leave you in his very capable hands. Professor Anthony Bogues is the Asa Messer Professor of Humanities and Africana Studies and Professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Brown University. He is a visiting professor and curator at Johannesburg University and was recently appointed Distinguished Professor at Large at the Africa Institute in Sharjah, UAE. He has worked on numerous projects with international agencies and is currently the convener on the UNESCO project Mapping Global Anti-Black Racism. He is the inaugural director of the Ruth Simmons Center for Slavery and Justice at Brown University. His work continues to focus on the Caribbean intellectual tradition, and he has done extensive research on C.L.R. James, Sylvia Wynter, Stuart Hall, and George Lamin. Professor Bogues is a prolific writer and has contributed numerous articles and is an associate editor at the Caribbean Journal, BIM. Ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome to our chair for today's events, Professor Anthony Bogues.
Thank you very much. And I want to add my own welcome to you all. Prime Minister Mayor Motley, former President of Nigeria, Chief Obasanjo, former Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Honorable P.J. Patterson, the Vice Chancellor of the University, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, and then I have a note of excuse from the Minister, Senator Honorable Dana Morris, from the Minister who's a minister without portfolio in the office of the Prime Minister, who sends her apologies that she has an emergency and cannot make this. Distinguished VPs, people all sitting in the front there, all protocols observed, Sir Ken Hall, Mrs. Beverly Manley, Duncan, Ambassador from Cuba. I just want to say all welcome and all protocol observed. Other members of the panels, who will speak during the course of this symposium, ladies and gentlemen, visitors, all distinguished people, which is everybody, welcome to this. I also would like to welcome the viewers online who are watching this program, and to say to them welcome as well, and to thank them for watching whatever platform they are using to watch this. I wish to welcome you all to this symposium, and I do so on behalf of the P.J. Patterson Institute for African Caribbean Advocacy and my alma mater, the University of the West Indies. This symposium occurs at an auspicious moment in global politics. We who live in this world can see that there are many crises around the world. These crises impact people all over the globe, but they are particularly acute for those of us who live in the Caribbean and in continental Africa. All these crises demand our attention, but I would like to draw our attention to three of them. Two debt and climate change, impact on our everyday lives of ordinary Caribbean and African people. And the third one that I would like to draw attention to is that of war. For those of us in the Caribbean, the business of war sometimes seems remote. But for those of us who live in some African states, particularly in a place like Sudan, where over 8 million people have been displaced, or in a place like the Congo, war is an everyday question. Before I do so, I want to talk about these three things very briefly. I want to frame this symposium, which is about strengthening cooperation between Africa and Caribbean states. The 20th century, that is the previous century, can be called one of world decolonization. It was a century in which one of the most significant world political events was the political independence of the over 150 colonies of the various European colonial powers. In the struggle to achieve political independence, there was tremendous solidarity between Africa and the Caribbean. Think, for example, of the International African Service Bureau in the 1930s in London, with leading members like Selah James, Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife of Marcus Garvey, and Jomo Kenyatta, who became the first president of Kenya. Their political program was the complete independence, not just of the Caribbean, but the complete independence of Africa and the Caribbean. Prior to that, think, for example, of the single largest black internationalist movement of the 20th century, the UNIA, the Garvey movement. And think of the various chapters that the Garvey movement had in the world, all over the world, as well as in Africa. The slogan, Africa for the Africans, those at home and abroad. 1945, think of the Fifth Pan-African Congress held in Manchester. The two key organizers, George Padmore of Trinidad and Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. So that there has been a historic link between Africa and the Caribbean that we should not forget. Think of the Bandung Conference in 1955, in which the key idea was about peace. And I mentioned that deliberately because we are living in times of war. Think about the non-aligned movement of the which was formed in 1961, and which became very active in the 1970s. And think of the three figures who were critical to that movement: Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Fidel Castro of Cuba, and Michael Manley of Jamaica. Therefore, what we are talking about is a certain kind of 20th century history of solidarity, of cooperation, of relations between Africa and the Caribbean. The solidarity was around the business of political independence. The solidarity in the non-aligned movement was about developing new arguments about the structure of the world economy and the formation of the new international economic order, but also it was importantly about political freedom in Zimbabwe and in South Africa. Therefore, for those of us both in Africa and the Caribbean, to discuss Africa and Caribbean cooperation, we need to begin from this particular platform. We need to have this particular perspective, a perspective around solidarities and cooperation. In the 1970s, this business of collaboration, of solidarities and cooperation was congealed around issues around commodity prices. That's still there. It was congealed around questions of the structures of the multinational corporation. That's still there. It congealed with the two sets of conferences that were important. One was held in Peru in 1980, the other one held in Cuba in 1981 around the business of debt and development. So today, when we think about these things, we think with that history in mind. So let me turn to one of the problems that I've identified, which is a crisis, which is that of debt. The total debt of Latin America and the Caribbean was in 2021 was $3 trillion US. In March last year, March of 2023, that debt had risen to $2.8 trillion. Had risen to $5.8 trillion. In Africa, the debt at the end of 2022, the public debt was $1.8 trillion, with the leading countries being the Congo, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Mauritius, and Angola. If you take the Latin American and Caribbean and African debt, then what you are looking at is a figure of $7.2 trillion. In 2022, we in the Caribbean, as well as in Africa, paid in debt service alone, that is just to service the debt, $443.5 billion. That is not paying the debt figure. That is paying interest. That's not paying principal. That's paying the interest, right? And other service charges. The question, therefore, that we need to ask ourselves in this context is such a situation sustainable for Africa and the Caribbean? And how do we cooperate to deal with this? Climate change. One of the things I think is important to understand is that climate change did not just emerge like instant coffee. Did not just emerge in ways in which we like to think about it. We now have climate change without a history. The history of what took us to climate change is essentially a history of colonialism and racial slavery. It's a history of 400 years of European cutting down trees, genocide, of ravaging the earth, being what I like to call masters of the universe, and feeling that as masters of the universe, they could do anything to this planet that's called Earth. We ourselves are not, that is, those of us from the Caribbean and from Africa, are not responsible for the devastation of the environment and the emergence of what has been called climate change. Prime Minister Motley, in September 2023, put this question on the table. She says, there is a question before us as to whether or not the so-called sustainable goals are sufficient, she argued, to meet the 17 targets on poverty, gender, equity, and environment. We therefore need to begin to think about now, not just that there is climate change, but we need to begin to think about what are the practical mechanisms that we from Africa and the Caribbean can begin to elaborate. For the University of the West Indies and the P.J. Patterson Institute, the question is, how do we facilitate conversations? How do we facilitate dialogue? But conversations and dialogue which can lead to practical measures and therefore to certain kind of international mechanisms in which we can begin to mitigate climate change. Not something we created because of a certain history of the making of the world and the role of European colonialism, but something that deeply impacts upon us because we all live in, the way I like to put it, we're all now in the same boat, and that boat is called Earth. And what it is, how do we live in this place called Earth? My third point has to do with the business of war. The violence in Gaza is a kind of violence that is very reminiscent of secular colonialism in Africa, in America, in Latin America, and in the Caribbean. It has focused our eyes. It is a kind of violence where there are only corpses and death, and where the lives of many Palestinians can only be lived through poems and tales of death. In this, we need to also remember Sudan and also remember the continuing conflicts in Congo, amongst other places. But we also should remember that the arms trade in 2022 was something like over $2.08 trillion. So that therefore what we also need to remember is that the manufacturing of what I call instruments of death, right? And we know it in the Caribbean in a different way, but the manufacturing of instruments of death is a profitable business. And in that profitable business, which grosses over $2 trillion, essentially means death for many, many people. And so they talk about a certain kind of militarization of the world is something that we, if in Africa and Caribbean, need to think about. And we do that with this, with remembering Bob Marley saying, we don't need to study war no more. One of the things we should note is that in 1955, when Bandung was first Bandung meeting, that its very first plank, was about peace in the world and how to create peace in the world. Distinguished audience and speakers, it is safe to say, I think, in our post-colonial world, that the ordinary lives of Africans, the ordinary life of people of the Caribbean are in trouble. Many feel that their future is not quite certain. In such a context, the collective bonds that drew us together in the past now need to be reignited, not on the old grounds, but on the new ones, where we can think hard about climate change, about debt, about war, and where we can think about how to develop, now that we're independent nations, develop and create economic cooperations between us, specifically in the realm of culture, which is a realm that I spent some time thinking about, but which I think is absolutely critical. There's a thing called black culture, African culture, African diaspora culture, that we need to think about as to what are the ways in which we can begin to cooperate. We, therefore, in the P.J. Patterson Institute, stand firm on the historical platforms which have constructed solidarities for us, solidarities which brought us to political independence. To move from political independence to begin to change societies for the ordinary African and for the ordinary Caribbean person means that we transform these solidarities into concrete economic development, concrete economic projects, concrete set of exchanges between us that can bring us together and to make us the force for good that we need to be, and the force that we actually began with when we started our struggles for independence against colonialism. With these words, I want to open this symposium and to thank you all very much for coming. The first speaker, this is being done by what the phrase is hybrid. So the first speaker is going to be Prime Minister from Barbados, Mia Mottley. Prime Minister Mottley.
Distinguished delegates, esteemed guests, it is my distinct honor and privilege to greet you on this wonderful occasion, albeit virtually. This morning, I'm reminded of the words of the late luminary James Baldwin, who said, and I quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." These words carry such a simple but profound wisdom that resonates deeply with us children of Africa and the diaspora, especially in the Caribbean. There is a great paradox that confronts us with the limitations of what can be accomplished when facing histories that cannot be undone. But equally, that speaks volumes to the limitless possibility that the resilience, determination, and cooperation of our communities can bring about for the betterment of humanity. Indeed, awareness and acknowledgement are essential precursors to the meaningful action and transformation that we have gathered here to reaffirm and to recommit to. But it is not our awareness and acknowledgement of history and its lingering effects in question. We are most certainly aware that throughout history, our communities of African descent have endured many injustices. We've suffered the terror of slavery, imperialism, colonialism. We've witnessed the exploitation, discrimination, and marginalization of our people. And we acknowledge that even when confronted by a tragic past, that history cannot be rewritten or undone, no matter how hard others try to just do that. The transformation we seek is a just and equitable society for all. And I'm confident that each and every one of us recognizes that the path to that transformation is firmly rooted in the product of our solidarity and, yes, our cooperation. The scars of exploitation and dispossession run deep, leaving a trail of inequality, poverty, and disenfranchisement regrettably in their wake. Many of our communities throughout Africa and the Caribbean continue to disproportionately bear the burden of historical injustices. And this is perpetuated by the global systems and structures that govern our world and that simply do not see or consider us. Relics that do not reflect the current or future needs of the global constituents that they claim to serve. These are the things that we must face for any real change to occur, and the imperative for the Africa-Caribbean cooperation that is necessary could not now be clearer with these matters in view. Our pursuit of reparative justice demands that we stand together as partners and as allies, amplifying our voices and advancing our common interests on the global stage. Our collaboration goes far beyond the obvious gains in trade and commercial relations. Those are certainly important and most welcome. But more importantly, our cooperation is a moral imperative, rooted in our shared commitment to justice, equality, and human dignity. I look forward ahead with great hope and optimism for the limitless prospects for Africa and the Caribbean to deepen the partnership and unlock new opportunities in our collaboration. From renewable energy and sustainable agriculture, to digital innovation and healthcare, to pharmaceutical access, our regions possess immense potential for cooperation and mutual benefit in education and in all other areas in which our people can find themselves occupied. By harnessing our collective strengths and resources, we can build a future where every individual has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background or their circumstances. Together, my friends, Africa and the Caribbean have the power to transform our societies and to build a future where equality, dignity, and prosperity are not just aspirations, but realities for ourselves and indeed the rest of the world over. As we continue on this long walk towards a brighter future for all in today's proceedings, I would like to encourage you to draw inspiration from the spirit of unity and resilience that has defined our shared history and our heritage. We can, yes, we can overcome any obstacle, achieve any goal, and build a world where fairness, justice, and equality are normative principles so long as we do it together. And as we speak at these high levels, let us remember that the first basic step in living the walk of these principles is just simply to see each other, hear each other, and treat each other with the dignity that we know we demand and respect. I look forward to hearing about these deliberations, and I thank you for the opportunity of being able to say a few words. All the very best.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Motley. The next speaker is Chief Obasanjo, former President of Nigeria.
Distinguished audience, ladies and gentlemen, let me start by thanking the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy and the University of the West Indies for the invitation to this symposium. On the 30th of July 2023, I and the most Honorable Percival J. Patterson, my good friend, were hosted by Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados in a discourse on emancipation for both regions, and in December 2023 at the convocation lecture of the Bells University of Technology, Ota, Nigeria. I and my dear friend again, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and Grenadines, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, expressed our position on how Africa and the Caribbean can improve development of both continents. Here I am again, speaking at this inaugural hybrid symposium on linking the Caribbean to Africa, this time focusing on the opportunities for Africa-Caribbean partnerships in the areas of climate change, information technology, and innovation. After Africa and the Caribbean, an underinvested relationship. The ties between the Caribbean and Africa runs deep. Our ties are based on a shared history, culture, oppression, and identity forged by the slave trade, which relocated more than 10 million black people to the West. This created large centers of African diaspora in the Caribbean and other parts of the world. This experience of slavery and colonialism inspired the formation of the Pan-African movement in the first half of the 1990s, led by the African diaspora outside of Africa. The two regions have continued to be brothers because our legacy is rooted in the pursuit of common interests, especially in the area of civil rights, the process of decolonization, and an end to apartheid. Africa cannot forget how the Caribbean and icons such as P.J. Patterson, Michael Manley, Fidel Castro, and Dame Nita Barrow participated in the attempt to bring down apartheid in South Africa. It will be recalled that in 2021, Africa and the Caribbean held the first Leaders Summit during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, laying the groundwork for concession loans, and in 2022, Africa's Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank, opened an office in Barbados, setting aside 1.5 billion in concession loans for areas which governments and the private sector can identify. Recently, a global movement to seek reparation for slavery has been forged with the African Union partnering with Caribbean countries to form a united front to persuade European nations to pay for mass crimes. The partnership between the African Union and CARICOM has intensified pressure on former slave-owning nations to engage with the reparations movement. The Caribbean is also exploring links to improve air and sea links between the two regions, which will boost trade, investment, and tourism, and promote cultural diversity. In the area of health security, the Health Development Partnership for Africa and the Caribbean was established to strengthen South-South cooperation and to build institutional capacity within and between the regions to address present health challenges. The rationale between the Health Department Partnership for Africa and Caribbean is the need to learn lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic and the importance of a robust health system on both sides. While Africa and the Caribbean have continued to work together for more than a century in various areas, especially in the areas of political, economic, and health security, there's a need to explore other critical areas which will improve development in both regions. Both regions have not invested enough in critical areas that can accelerate development and improve the lives of the citizenry. It is remarkable that this inaugural hybrid symposium on linking the Caribbean to Africa is considering critical areas such as climate change, information technology, and innovation. Africa and the Caribbean remain some of the most vulnerable regions to the impact of climate change, despite having contributed the least to global warming and having the lowest emissions. The regions face the risk of exponential damage, posing risks to the enormous infrastructural investment, food security, public health, and livelihood. Climate change represents a major threat to Africa's achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and the UNEP commissioned research estimated that the goal or the cost of adaptation, I state that. I take that again. Climate change represents a major threat to Africa's achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and the UNEP commissioned research estimates that the cost of adoption to climate change could reach 50 million a year by 2050. Also, the Caribbean is already bearing the brunt of climate change as its large coastal population and exposed location leave it at the mercy of rising sea levels, stronger storms, and worsening droughts. Some of the sovereign nations in the region are already experiencing climate disruptions, putting their tourism-dependent countries deeply in debt. The Caribbean will need more than $100 million for adaptation programs. There is therefore a need for a joint African-Caribbean action plan to tackle issues related to climate change, resilience, adaptation, and natural disasters. Africa and the Caribbean must collaborate, and the international community, with the international community, to increase available financing for the SDGs and other regional goals. Both regions must come up with their own goals and targets with regards to the climate change action. These goals and targets must focus on climate finance, including grants through multilateral development banks, concessional lending windows, promoting climate resilient debt clauses, and initiatives such as the debt for climate swaps and issuance of green bonds. At the Olusegun Obasanjo Presidential Library, we are committed to a cleaner and greener environment. The entire complex is moving swiftly to 100% solar power. We are ensuring zero carbon emission, zero waste, and healthy ecosystem. Africa and the Caribbean must harness the potential to create a regional framework that focuses on a green recovery and accelerate the transition to a more sustainable system. As part of South-South cooperation, I would propose that both regions should establish the Afro-Caribbean Foundation through the P.J. Patterson Institute, Bells University of Technology, Yota, Nigeria, the University of the West Indies, and other partners. The foundation should support efforts, including research and development, to focus on climate-smart actions and renewable engineering. In addition, the foundation should continually work on bringing Africa and the Caribbean close in everything. The Center for Human Security and Dialogue at the Olusegun Obasanjo Presidential Library can provide technical support to the foundation as it serves as a think tank on environmental security to governments and other agencies. Another area of focus is information, technology, and innovation. I am pleased that both regions have scored high points in these areas. However, we can learn from one another. The Caribbean has continued to lead in cutting-edge technology, which has shaped the local economies. One of the most remarkable aspects of technology's influence in the Caribbean is its role in empowering small businesses. Customarily, the Caribbean has relied on tourism and agriculture. But now, with the help of digital platforms, local entrepreneurs are reaching global audiences. Tourism, which is the lifeblood of many Caribbean economies in the region, have become smarter. Africa has also seen that the Caribbean is not just embracing technology for economic growth, they are also taking giant strides towards green sustainability due to the region's vulnerability to climate change. The region is not just generating solar power, but also investing in cutting-edge battery storage solutions. Smart agriculture has also become a norm as the region is embracing precision agriculture, leveraging on drones, smart irrigation systems, and sensors. Nevertheless, the Caribbean has much to learn from Africa's use of technology to advance micropayment schemes and support activities in the health sector, as well as in the development of technology hubs. Africa is also embracing precision agriculture and climate-smart agriculture. To link the Caribbean to Africa, it is important to come up with a framework for experience sharing, and I believe that the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy will be instrumental in providing this framework. Also, technology transfer is imperative, and it has an important role to play in cooperation between the Caribbean and Africa. The Olusegun Obasanjo Presidential Library and Bells University of Technology, OTA, in Nigeria, is ready to work with the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy and the University of the West Indies to establish a center that will provide a platform to coordinate, undertake, and share research and other experiences related to climate change and information and technology. The recommended Afro-Caribbean Foundation can synergize and play an important role. The time for a Caribbean-African relationship that focuses on development cooperation between the two regions, as well as collaboration to influence policy and debate on the global stage, is now. Regular meetings between the regions to unlock benefits on both sides must become the norm. Let me conclude by emphasizing that the future of Africa-Caribbean relations is one ripe with huge benefits. But it requires the investment of time, research attention, and political will and political action to transform the relationship into one fit for our purpose. For years, both regions have talked about cementing their relationship, and I believe that with over 70 countries, Africa and Caribbean states can form an important bloc and an influential coalition partner. The P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy and the University of the West Indies must continue to build bridges between nations and the people of the Africa Union and CARICOM to engage in activities which will promote a truly symbolic and symbiotic relationship. The Bells University of Technology and Olusegun Obasanjo Presidential Library are ready on the African side to to cooperate and collaborate in bridge building. Thank you for listening, and I wish you successful deliberations.
Thank you very much, Chief Obasanjo. The next speaker is Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Professor Beckles.
Thank you very much, Chairman Professor Bogues, the Honorable P.J. Patterson, the Honorable Mayor Motley, and His Excellency Obasanjo, Sir Ken Hall, and Secretary General of CARICOM, Dr. Barnett, our Excellencies, distinguished guests, and all participants, colleagues and students. Very good morning, everyone. From time to time, humble academics, we find ourselves sandwiched between our distinguished leaders who we respect. I recall 23 years ago at the UN conference in Durban on matters relevant to this symposium, I found myself in panel between, on my left, Arafat, and on my right, the great Fidel Castro. And all I could say then was, ladies and gentlemen, I agree with my colleague on the left, and I agree with my colleague on the right, and I sat down. Today, I'm sandwiched between Prime Ministers Motley and Patterson, who I respect and are very good friends, and General Obasanjo. And I feel as if I wish to say the same thing, but on this occasion, I'm on home ground. And by circumstances, I have to make some remarks. Prime Minister Eric Williams, so deeply frustrated when the Caribbean community could not federate itself on a sustainable basis. And he reflected in vexation that we had not done what we should have done, which is to harness ourselves as one. He made a statement which is really symbolic and relevant. He said, "What God has put asunder, let no man put together." And invoke future generations to put it together, that this separation of Africa and its Caribbean diaspora and diasporas elsewhere certainly was not an act of God. If anything, it was an act of the other fellow, the demonic force that set us apart. We therefore have, using the Williams paradigm, we have a responsibility to transcend all of that and return to a state of normalcy, which is for the African people to realize, no matter where they are globally situated, they really are one community that should function as one community. The concept of separation is therefore critical. Separation was the fundamental objective of the European colonial project. How to separate people not only from their ancestral homes, to separate them from their culture, to separate them from their humanity, and to separate them from a vision of a common future. Not only was it meant to be of economic significance, it was also meant to be of cultural significance, because with the separation would come a sense of the elimination of the possibility of a future restructuring as one. If the culture is erased, on what basis then could integration take place? And that was all part of that epistemology of colonization. And this was all skillfully planned, carefully designed, and sustained over centuries. Colonization depended upon the effects of this. As in all histories, as in all circumstances of history, wherever there is a force, there is a counterforce. And the counterforce of African people was swift and precise. This we heard this morning from our chair, the narrative around the Pan-Africanist movement that was an initial swift reaction to this situation. Pan-Africanism, therefore, was the counter-narrative that said, we will put it back together. We will, as an intergenerational project, we will put it back together. And in earnest, we started that project in Haiti in 1804, when Haiti declared its independence. And in its first constitution as an independent nation, the Haitian government declared that all African people, or any person of African descent who arrives on the shores of Haiti, no matter where they were coming from, would be declared automatically free and a citizen. And therefore, citizenship for black people first occurred in our hemisphere in the context of Haiti. What the Haitians were doing were laying the foundation for the rehabilitation of Africanness, of blackness, and of solidarity. This is how we started. The freedom agenda, which of course was the grand objective, was launched from the moment the first generation of enslaved Africans were brought to this part of the world. They were the ones who laid the foundation for what we are discussing here this morning. And our University of the West Indies has a critical remit to facilitate this paradigm and to be at the center of visioning for the future. And I wish to confine my comment specifically to the role of the UWI in this regard. The UWI was birthed within the context of struggle. The workers' revolution of the 1930s, in which Caribbean people rose up from Belize through to St. Kitts, down the Eastern Caribbean archipelago, back up to Jamaica, Trinidad, all of that. The stand against colonization and the demand for freedom. It was that 1930s revolution which, when investigated by the British government, yielded the idea that a university of the West, a university in the West Indies, was going to be a necessary part of the future. But it wasn't a British idea, though it was articulated in the Moyne Commission to establish a university facility. It came out of the workers' movement. Garvey spoke about institutions of higher education necessary for this region. So by the time the people had risen up against colonization, the idea of a university in the English-speaking region was already quite matured and quite advanced. And so 1948, this university came into being within the context of the Workers' Revolution. It started as a medical school. Again, no surprises there, because the report into the Workers' Revolution has stated categorically that the condition of the working people of the Caribbean, the medical and health condition of these people, were the worst in the British Empire. It stated very, very clearly that the public health of black people, in particular in the Caribbean, was an embarrassment to the British Empire. Because 100 years had gone by since emancipation, and on the centenary of emancipation, the people had risen up on the centenary, and the imperial government said, well, you know, their health is the worst in the empire, and something should be done. And thus we started as a medical school to repair the health of the people, to repair the health of the poor. We started as a public health reparations project. That is how UWI started, to clean up all of these diseases that were the result of hunger and malnutrition, to do something about that. We therefore have to be true to our origins and to our existential being. We have to be true to it. As a university, we have to carry the integrity of those who established us. We were established as a public university to serve the interests of the public. Not surprisingly, 20 years after we started, Professor Walter Rodney, entering here at Mona, with an objective of bringing African history across the Atlantic to the people, to engage them in scholastic teaching and research around African history, and furthermore, to take that pedagogy out of the classrooms and into the community. And so Professor Rodney began his journey, giving his public lectures in Papine, Augustown, and wherever he was invited to speak, he spoke, bringing African history and building the bridge between the diaspora and its homeland. That was the Rodney Project. As you all know, he was declared persona non grata by the government of Jamaica, resulting in a massive uprising of the people, creating a circumstance, once again in history, where people were standing apart from their government. And so UWI continued that journey into the world of decolonization, of building the bridge, which we have heard this morning, laying the foundation for that bridge, to normalize a circumstance where the African continent and its diasporas would be integrated. The University of the West Indies has been steadfast to this objective. About 7 years ago, UNESCO, as you know, who had been publishing the general history of Africa and had published those 8 magisterial volumes, the General History of Africa, volume 1 through to 8, and each of these volumes is about 1,000 pages. It was a magnificent gathering of African scholars, historians, to produce those 8 volumes. Volume 9 was about to go into conception. And there was a gathering of academics in Addis, brought to Ethiopia to talk about Volume 9. Empowered in my role and function as a historian within the UWI, I launched my critique of those 8 volumes, celebrating the achievement, but saying, hold on a second. These 8 volumes are all about the history of African people in Africa. How about all of those African peoples scattered across the world? Is the assumption of these 8 volumes that the moment you step off the shore of Africa, you have stepped outside of your history and you are no longer, therefore, an African? You have become something else. Is that the assumption of these 8 volumes? It's a pedagogical crisis that we are facing with here today. Well, the 500 academics in the room then said, okay, Beckles, since you're asking for the work, you have it. You will be the editor of Volume 9. And Volume 9 is about to appear, The Global History of Africa. That is hopefully in the next couple of weeks we will hear of the publication of Volume 9, The General History of UNESCO, Volume 9, Global African History. But that was an impetus coming out of the UWI. Since then, we have established in Nigeria, with the University of Lagos, a UWI UNILAG Center for African History and African Culture in the University of Lagos. And you can imagine how I felt as Vice Chancellor when I arrived at the University of Lagos and the students from the University Chorale performed to welcome me the Jamaica National Anthem. And in a building that says, the University of the West Indies, big sign, University of the West Indies, and the University of Lagos. Because I was asked to give a lecture on the history of African migration to Jamaica. And as you know, the majority of African people here in Jamaica were brought down through the eastern Nigerian hinterland of Igbo and brought down to the coast and shipped out. And the vast majority of you are Igbos by background and bloodline. The first trans of Africans who came out, it was a minor migration, came out of the Gold Coast area, thus the Ashanti, Fa, and the Ganti and the Ga people who came. But the second wave, which was the larger wave, came out of Igbo land. And you know, the only place in the world where the people plant their yam on the stick is in Igbo land and Jamaica. You don't see this any other place. And all the other countries of the world, people allow the yam to run, the vine to run on the ground. In Jamaica, you put a stick. That is Igbo technology at work in Jamaica, transported across the ocean. And so we have the foundations, or we're helping to lay the foundations as a university for building this bridge. We've heard about the Caribbean's role in the liberation of Southern Africa, not just South Africa, but also Angola, Mozambique, the role we played, most of our territories, a history that is yet to be effectively told. Some of you may remember the the plane carrying Cuban soldiers to fight in Angola, Mozambique, which was blown up off the coast of Barbados because it had stopped there as part of the refueling to get across, refueling also in Guyana. So all of the Caribbean was involved in one way or another of sending Caribbean soldiers out to Africa to put an end to the atrocities of the South African army. And building upon that history, respecting that history of Caribbean people's commitment and sacrifice, we have established in UWI, in the University of Johannesburg, the UWI Johannesburg Center for Global African Studies. And this project between the UWI and the University of Johannesburg has produced a master's program which we will go live with in September, a global online master's program. Master's online program, UWI Joburg, joint degree of 2 universities, master's degree in global African affairs. Against all of this background, we were fortunate that within our ecosystem, one of our most distinguished, a great alumnus, Honorable P.J. Patterson, conceptualized the idea of building an institution in his alma mater to lay the foundation, to strengthen the foundation for advocacy. So yes, the university itself is involved in teaching, research, but to have an institution dedicated to the global advocacy of these principles completed the paradigm. And thus, the University of the West Indies Council approved the establishment of the P.J. Patterson Institute for Global Africa Caribbean Diplomacy. This is a phenomenal institution, and we are gathered here today under its auspices. PJ, we thank you. There's a tremendous amount of work that the UWI has to continue to undertake in playing our part in laying the foundation for this 21st century future. We have heard from our chair, yes, it took all of the 19th century to eradicate slavery. From Haiti, as I said before, in 1804, first nation to so do, through to the emancipation legislation in Brazil in 1888. Whole century to get rid of it. It has taken all of the 20th century to lay the foundation for decolonization, human rights, civil rights, citizenship, all of these things. It took us another 100 years to achieve, to be where we are today. And this is why we have said, logically, the force of history at work, this 21st century will be the century of reparatory justice, will be the century of Africa, diaspora, solidarity, and institution building. This is now the moment. 200 to 300 years to arrive at this crossroads, where we now have available the state power, institutions, ideologies, and intellectual constructs. We now have all of this to do the work. to now build the enterprise of Global Africa. And Global Africa is a concept that will need future articulation. What is the difference between Global Africa and Pan-Africanism? Well, if I may generalize, even if loosely, Pan-Africanism was built as a philosophy and a political practice around the notion that first we must free Africa, and it's the role and duty of all of us everywhere to so do, and in that process, build the intellectual solidarity for future action. That project remains clearly an important one. There are now 55 nations, Professor, in Africa. And the diaspora that had mobilized to liberate Mother Africa, the diaspora is now made up also of independent nations. So the diaspora is no longer simply an intellectual agenda, movements and organizations. This is now nations in its own right. Jamaica is now a nation in its own right, as is Nigeria. And if the majority of people here in Jamaica derive from Nigeria, and that is the bond, but there are now two independent nations in their own right. So the concept of Global Africa says that the diasporas have now evolved mostly into nations in their own right. Of course, there are communities like the African Americans are part of the USA, but the Caribbean is now made up of nations, and most of them with African majority communities. And so we are now building with different blocks. We now have different tools with which to build this solidarity for the future, so that Jamaica, Barbados, and so on can go to the UN, have solidarity in the General Assembly, formulate diplomatic strategies to facilitate trade, climate change reform, as we've heard. All of these big issues that are facing us today, we can now function as individual nations in solidarity, in a Pan-Africanist framework, but as independent nations with our own views and how to build this system for the future. We have turned significantly the colonial system upon its head. We are rejecting the separatist philosophy that underpinned colonialism. We can now build that solidarity. So we're now on our way. And we, all of us, have a duty and a responsibility. Institutions like universities have a critical role to play, working in solidarity with our political leaders, our statesmen and stateswomen, to build out this new infrastructure. The University of the West Indies is a very important institution within this future paradigm. It has this role to play. It must continue to play this role, because standing in solidarity with our political leaders who are building this bridge. We now have an African Development Bank in the Caribbean. Africa, the African Union has declared that 2025 will be the year of reparations for Africa. This is an enormous policy achievement. The African Union, that was not in solidarity with us 10 years ago on this point, has reversed itself and has now said that 2025 is the year of reparations for Africa and all of its people. This is an enormous achievement. What we now have to do is to build out the advocacy around this policy framework, create the diplomacy to enable it to happen. Because we always knew in the Caribbean that until the African governments come on board fully with reparations, speaking with one voice, the Europeans will be able to divide us. But now we are in full solidarity on this critical moment. So we are building this bridge over which the people of the Caribbean and the people of Africa can move back and forwards seamlessly, normally. This is what we have been trying to achieve, to completely uproot the separatist policy of European colonizers and replace that with the normalcy of movement across the Atlantic. In other words, what we intend to do is to shrink this Atlantic space so that the Caribbean peoples could jump on the plane and go across and come back, come and go as they wish. This is what we are working for now. The normalcy, the normalization of the relationship between a continent and its diasporas. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vice Chancellor. The last speaker in this session is the Right Honorable P.J. Patterson, the statesman in residence and the former Prime Minister of Jamaica. Honorable Patterson.
Our Chair, Professor Anthony Bogues, Vice Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, Pro Vice Chancellor and professors and members of the academic community, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, both here and those online. Let me begin by extending to all of you a very warm and cordial welcome on behalf of the Institute. May I express my profound gratitude to those who have already participated in this symposium and others who will contribute to the illuminating presentations to follow. This inaugural symposium that seeks to face the challenges and find creative solutions as we move forward to strengthen cooperation between Africa and the Caribbean is the first of its kind, spawned by the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy and strongly supported by the Vice-Chancellery and the Global Affairs Unit at the University of the West Indies. The concept and structure of this format for an entire series was the brainchild of one who is sitting innocently in the hall, Professor Sir Kenneth Hall. He saw it as a fulfillment of our mandate to develop a program of work to engage with the full range of academics and pertinent research from scholars in the diaspora for the production of a strategic framework for Africa-Caribbean Cooperation and Action. As you know and have been reminded, the Institute was established as a vehicle to promote, encourage, and facilitate a fertile exchange of cultural groups, artists, scholars, entertainers, athletes, and sportspersons to effect closer ties between Africa, the Caribbean, and our diaspora. Thanks to modern technology, we can overcome the physical separation of geographical distance by a hybrid gathering, and we have already seen the fruits of that. Information technology allows us to escape the time and hazards of travel to permit this hybrid dialogue. Indeed, the role of innovation, AI, and other new technological developments must bring us closer to see how we can work together, because the world is rapidly changing and we cannot afford to wait any longer to chart our own future, strengthen our linkages, and form our own coalition. It is imperative that we in Africa and in the Caribbean build our own coalition, because others have. The world in which we live today was designed to exploit rather than to benefit the likes of us and to keep us in subservience. There's no need, nor is there time in this symposium to dwell on the human obscenity of slavery and the criminal plunder of colonialism. Needless to say, the Institute will lend its full support in the advocacy for reparative justice, as outlined by our Vice Chancellor. And yet, how can we ignore the current disarray and plight of the Haitian people, whose only cardinal sin was to win their fight for freedom, and whose fate has been one since then of imperial extortion and repeated external invasions? We have a moral obligation with like-minded countries on the African continent to enable the Haitian people to determine their own path and realize their full potential within a democratic and participatory framework of governance. Also, how can we fail to reflect that Cuba, who lost sons in the final struggle for the liberation of Southern Africa and the eradication of apartheid, has suffered a cruel and immoral economic blockade for the last 6 decades. Moreover, it should not escape our notice and condemnation that without rhyme or reason, the United States, since the removal of President Obama, has outrageously restored Cuba to the list of state-sponsored terrorism, That categorization is the more vicious as it extends to business and economic relations with third countries and commercial institutions. We in the Caribbean and also parts of Africa note that Cuba has extended at great internal costs and sacrifice access to training our students and the provision of doctors, nurses, and teachers in the fields of health and education. Our voices must be heard loud and clear in denouncing these pernicious measures by the might of hegemonic power. We draw this to attention in our repeated call for the 54 nations of Africa and the 14 Caribbean countries to act as a single bloc at the global level, working in tandem with the nations of Latin America and the developing countries of Asia, as simultaneously we build that irreversible and inseparable chain of unity and solidarity which links us with the African diaspora worldwide. Nearly 3 years ago, the first historic African Caribbean Summit accepted the incalculable value of unity in a changing, selfish, and turbulent world. It ordered that full collaboration be institutionalized and that essential resources be mobilized for critical programs and the facilitation of people-to-people integration. The Institute for Africa-Caribbean Advocacy was established to buttress and support such a bold adventure. Here this morning, the P.J. Patterson Institute for Caribbean Advocacy boldly embraces the challenges of its extensive mandate. We have a program of activities that will not only acknowledge our differences, and there are some, but we also seek to embrace our similarities and build on our strengths. We believe in the sharing of knowledge and capacity building. We are proud to say we have the intellectual capacity through our Distinguished Scholars Program, which comprises academics, technical experts, and authors from our region, Africa, and the diaspora. And I repeat, authors, as we attempt to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. The Institute was created to become a hub for conversations such as the one we commence today, to seek access to intellectual resources and focus on the pressing challenges that face global Africa and the Caribbean. The Institute will endeavor to bring intellectual rigor to research in areas such as finance, trade and investment, tourism, culture, and sports. The COVID-19 pandemic shows us that the health of our people must command priority attention. We in the Caribbean should remember that initially we had to rely on our African friends to share with us the vaccines that they received. This is an area where a shared perspective, where joint research and development projects are critical to our survival. We already know of the vast number of medicinal plants which are to be found here in the Caribbean and Africa. We must learn to unlock their curative properties for the wealth of our people. Today's symposium will focus on the use of digital technology to open new channels in which to operate businesses and to strongly encourage the integration of science and technology in our education systems. We must be at the cutting edge by fully engaging our own creative skills, and particularly, we have to lock in our younger population. Today, we are going to be tackling the urgency of climate change and resilience. Our colleagues from South Africa will tell us their story, while our colleagues from the region will share the international conversations and what our governments and citizens need to do to avert the threat of global warming. Those of us, and we all are, from small island states, are at particular risk due to our geographical location. During this series of symposia, the Institute will examine several areas that can help to build our nations and empower our people. We will look in another such symposium at the issue of food security, as we recognize that Africa has 60% of the world's arable land, and the Caribbean continues to import a large percentage of its food for consumption, which will grow as tourism expands unless we take positive action. We need coordinated action to stimulate agriculture in order to achieve the highest level of self-sufficiency that is possible. The Institute is committed to exploring and bringing together our peoples using our cultural and creative expressions. Again, in another seminar, we plan to look at how we can harness this creative spirit and energy that our ancestors used. We want to tell our own stories. And if I may be allowed to use this opportunity to introduce the new research fellow at the Institute, Professor Paulette Ramsey, who will be the moderator at one of our sessions. We want to allow our people to express themselves and connect with peoples of a single descent. There is no denying the similarities between our music. Just listen to the works of Lucky Dube, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Burning Spear, and our brothers and sisters from the continent. We recognize that together we can do great things. I believe the Institute is an important part of that global team from the African continent, the Caribbean, and the diaspora. We have as our chief reporter, who is not present in the room but participating by digital communications, Dr. Glenford Howe, who will follow the discourse and recommendations. So we don't want this to be just a talk shop. We want it to a place from which action can emanate. And so the discussions and the decisions will be shared with the secretariats of CARICOM and the African Unity as they seek to discharge the functions that were assigned to them by the 2021 Summit of Heads. And hopefully, they will prove useful in the documentation that has to be ready for the second summit when that is convened. And again, I say, I hope it will not be long before that second meeting is convened. I am very, very concerned as a keen observer that if we're not careful, the first meeting could also be our last. Patrons, colleagues, and friends, let me again welcome you to the first of our outreach and advocacy events hosted by the Institute. I also invite you to join our Africa-Caribbean Conversation series, which will be broadcast on UWI TV. And during the break, we will be showing the first in that series for those who choose to remain in this room. Let me take this opportunity to thank all the members of my team, the Office of Global Affairs, the Office of the Vice Chancellor, for their input and assistance in today's events. Let me also give a special thanks to UWI TV and to one of our sponsors, the Grace Kennedy Group. I know they are sponsoring another activity which is not taking place too far away from here at this time. And let me again thank the innocent Sir Kenneth Hall for his invaluable assistance. To all our distinguished and learned panelists, we're looking forward very much to hear from you as you share your knowledge and best practices with us. We look forward eagerly to the illuminating exchanges to follow and a very glorious beginning. Thank you all, and see you not only today, but when next we convene to pursue our mission.
Thank you very much, Honorable Patterson. We have about 10 minutes, and my instructions were that if there was time, we should leave, we should ask folks for questions. I don't think we can have questions for the folks who are online, because they may not be there now, but certainly for the persons who have spoken up here. So does anybody want to open the baton, so to speak? Yes, please. You want, and I'm told you need to go up there to the mic so this can be recorded. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for this illuminating and brilliant day. I would like to bring to the attention of the audience the fact that we have had literally hundreds or thousands of our people who have gone to work in Africa. And we are not yet getting information about what these people have done. Because the bridge includes the people like Maureen Warner-Lewis and so on, who have worked on the continent and work in the Caribbean. So I would like one of the outcomes to be a register of people who have worked in the continent. I know about 10 or 20 people myself. And I will give one example. Mr. Michael Archer, who is an engineer, worked in South Africa. We visited South Africa, and this person came and said, "Do you know this man? He comes from Jamaica. He is brilliant," they said, in managing the people. So we already have people who have been going and coming. And I would like us to have a register of those people. I'm wondering if I'm too old to become part of this group now, you know? But that's another matter. But I would love a register to be created. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that. I think it's actually it's an important point, because there is one of the things that we have to be, I think, be very mindful of, is that the business of the relationship between continental Africa and the Caribbean should not just be a state-state relationship, that it has to be in people-people, that we have to begin to know each other. We in the Caribbean, if you think about Africa, you think about one country, right? But Africa is not a country, it's a continent. On the African continent, if you say you come from the Caribbean, they immediately say you come Bob Marley or Usain Bolt, and therefore Jamaica. It's not a surprise. I don't have a problem. I'm a Jamaican, but there's a thing called Caribbean, and so one of the things that I think is important, and this registrar might help, is that each of us have what I call 50%. 50% on this side about understanding in continental Africa, 50% in continental Africa about understanding in Caribbean. We need to begin to reduce that so that we know each other. And people-to-people exchange is really one of the most important things. And beginning with the registrar would help. So thanks very much for that.
I'd like to expand on that response, if I may. The Institute in particular is not only about discussions like this or the writing of papers, policy positions, etc. It's very much about people-to-people contact. So we want to know who are the people in the Caribbean who are operating on the continent, and vice versa, the people from Africa who are operating in the Caribbean islands or territories. We have a register in the Institute of Friends of the Institute. So anybody who wants to be a friend of the Institute can send us particulars about themselves, their addresses, etc., and contacts which might be very useful to make with persons who are working on either side of the pond, to bring to reality, to make meaningful the collaboration and the integration and the unity which we are seeking to achieve. So we very much welcome that information.
Thank you.
It would be an enormous project, and that is why it should be supported, because it's a project that would include so many different categories of Caribbean peoples who have traversed Africa in the last 150 years. Teachers, writers, nurses, priests, so many different type of people. And you meet them wherever you go in Africa, multi-generational people who have been participating in decolonization. So I would suggest that the register should also carry stories about the why these people took the decision to go to Africa to perform. Sometimes they become very interesting. I mean, I was in Ghana about 10 years ago, and the Caribbean community in Accra decided to host me at a breakfast meeting. And I arrived at this place, and there were about 500 or 600 Caribbean people who had been living in Ghana for between 0 and 100 years, and they all came out. But the story that captured my mind was a very elderly lady, maybe in her 90s. She came up to me, and I heard from her language that she was a Bajan. And she said to me, which Beckles, and listen to the language, which Beckles you is? And I said, well, I'm from the St. Andrew parish. She said, are you related to Aidan Beckles? I said, that's my dad. You're Aidan's son? Yes. I said, what are you doing here? During the polio epidemic in Barbados in the early 50s, she was a nurse. And she did a tremendous amount of work to help those babies that had contracted poliomyelitis. And after 5 years of working with the children in Barbados, she decided she wanted to go and help the children in Africa. And there was this project to carry nurses to Ghana to help to manage the polio outbreak. And she went there in the 50s and had been there for 60 years. Her entire adult life, from she was in her late 20s to her 90s, she was working with public health and all of the outbreak of diseases and so on. She took the experience from the Caribbean and was in Africa. And I would venture to say that there are thousands of people like that in all walks of life. We might not be able to capture all of them, but we could capture the why, the projects to which they contributed, and why they felt it was necessary to provide this Pan-African service. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really great addition. And as you say that, there are numerous stories I have of Ghanaians coming to me to say, I have a national song for you, but I won't repeat that song because it wasn't a national song, but it was taught by a set of teachers in Ghanaian schools. Yes, please.
Sir, the Institute also has a website, and we would welcome postings of this kind on the website.
Yeah, great. Yes, please. You are the last person, ma'am. Sorry, 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be here at this inaugural African Global Bridge. There are 3 challenges that I would like to hear from our leaders. One, the language barrier within Africa. There are about 2,000 languages that are spoken across Africa, and it has been one of the challenges in terms of the unity and the kind of collaboration that we hope to achieve at the pace. The second question is the rise in Burkina Faso and Nigeria. What's our policy? What are we proposing? What are we putting on the table to assist this merger that we see happening? And then the third thing is our call for action in terms of what is our position in terms of assisting and enabling Haiti. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's a long list there. I don't know who. Honorable Patterson.
There are differences in language, not only in Africa, but also in the Caribbean. Both the African Union and Caribbean community have identified the languages of communications between nations who belong to the respective organizations. And therefore, we don't get ourselves confused or too involved in the differences of languages. We communicate in the languages that have been accepted by both bodies. In respect of Burkina Faso, Niger, etc., the Institute certainly does not get itself involved in trying to formulate foreign policies or constitutional arrangements within member countries. Any scholarship will identify what may have impelled Burkina Faso, Niger, etc., to move in that direction. I don't think many people know that are aware that the former French colonies, as a condition for their independence, had to sign to 11 conditions. I won't enumerate what those conditions are, but really you can see very easily why they would be repulsive to any country that is seeking to exercise real and meaningful sovereignty. In respect of Haiti, that's a matter which is being dealt with by CARICOM, with 3 persons who have been identified as the eminent representatives, and personally, because of my own previous involvement, I have been in contact with them to the extent where they feel any experience I might have acquired might prove useful.
All right. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The University of the West Indies, we declared ourselves a multilingual university 3 years ago, that all students graduating from this university must now be proficient language-wise in at least one non-English language. And we are offering courses, conversation courses, academic courses in Swahili and Yoruba I think there are about 5 African languages that we are currently exposing our students to. And that is part of our bridge building. On the Haitian issue, there's a principle I think that we, the historians, are insisting upon in the political negotiations, is that historic contributions ought to be respected in contemporary discussions. And I made reference earlier to the Haitian Constitution that provided that all African peoples who arrive in Haiti ought to be declared citizen and free. And that was at a time when every society in this hemisphere was based on slavery. And here was one country in the middle that says, if you come here, you're a citizen. And it wasn't just a constitutional construct that was not activated in the field. There's the great story of Jamaica in 1816, when a ship, having left Spanish Town Harbor, went to Port Royal Harbor, and while the captain was on land taking care of the paperwork, the 17 slaves on the ship took the ship and went to Haiti, because they knew of the Haitian constitutional provision, took the ship and arrived in Trouban and were welcomed as Haitian citizens and free. And the owner of the ship, and on his claim, the owner of the people, wrote to the Haitian government demanding the return of his property. And that letter was sent by the governor of Jamaica to the president of Haiti. And President Pétion wrote back and said, well, Honorable Sir, your ship is here in the harbor. But the people who were on board are now citizens of the Republic of Haiti. And our Constitution does not recognize property rights in human beings, like your country, Britain, and these people are free. The correspondence between Haiti and Kingston went on for 8 years and went all the way to the Privy Council. The owner of the ship petitioned the Privy Council that the Haitian government must return his property. Of course, all of those correspondences, I should tell you, by the way, are in the Spanish Town Archive. So if you want to go to the Spanish Town Archive, you can read those letters for yourselves between Kingston and Port-au-Prince. But the people were not sent back to Jamaica because they were citizens of Haiti, and it was as simple as that. Now, the question is whether those historical contributions impose an obligation on today's politics. And that is a big question for us to answer, that here was a country at its most vulnerable, making the greatest gesture possible within their constitution, and how do we return the integrity of that position to the people of Haiti? And those are issues I think that academia should keep in the forefront of the conversations.
Thank you all very much. I just want to end with on one thing about Haiti that may be useful for this audience, that the Haitian themselves, not just constitutionally, but the books that the Haitians were writing about the revolution, during the revolution, the way they thought of what they were doing was not just freedom for black people, but, I'm going to quote the sentence, what we are doing is working for the redemption of Africa. And so I think that one wants to think about that when one thinks about Haiti and what Haiti stood for and remains the idea of what Haiti was for black freedom. Okay, thank you all very, very much for this session.
Thank you very much, all the members at the head table. And thank you for being a wonderful audience. But we're not finished. I'm inviting you for a break, and we do have refreshments. Please note that no food is allowed in this space. And we invite you to be back here by 11:45 so that we can continue. And you can hear more very interesting discussions and conversations. For those of you who are coming back in, we will be showing, as PM Patterson noted, the first in the series of Africa Caribbean Reasoning series, and it is a wonderful conversation with PM Patterson, which he will share with you in more detail what the Institute is about. So please. To the Africa Caribbean Reasoning series, hosted by the P.J. Patterson Institute for Africa Caribbean Advocacy at the University of the West Indies. I am your host, Sharon Bogswolf, and I invite you to join us every month for this reasoning led by our distinguished scholars. UWI TV will rebroadcast our program at different times.